I spent 32 years working the timber stands around Marquette, Michigan, running a small crew of 4 men cutting hardwood. That's the kind of work where you learn the difference between being alone and being lonely, and I preferred the former to just about anything else the world had to offer. My ex-wife Sharon got the house in town as part of the settlement, which suited me fine. I moved my things into a trailer near Alberta Creek, close enough to my timber tracks that I could hear the water running at night through the single-pane windows, far enough from civilization that the only voices I heard belonged to men I'd hired myself. The trailer wasn't much to look at. A 1987 Fleetwood with rust eating through the wheel wells and a propane furnace that clicked and groaned like an old dog settling into sleep. But it had what I needed. A roof that didn't leak too badly, a bed that fit my frame, and a porch where I could sit with a beer on Friday nights and watch the tree line without anyone asking me what I was thinking about. Sharon used to hate that about me, the quiet. She'd fill silence with words, the way some people fill holes with dirt, just packing it in until there wasn't any space left for anything else. After 15 years of marriage, I think the silence between us got louder than her voice ever could be, and that was that. My crew knew better than to expect conversation that wasn't about board feet and saw maintenance. There was Pete Salonen, 26, strong as a draft horse and about as talkative. His older brother Danny ran the skidder and had opinions about everything, from carburetor mix to politics. None of which I asked for, but all of which I got anyway. Marcus Webb, our third Sawyer, had come up from Iron Mountain 10 years back and stayed because his girlfriend worked at the hospital. He was reliable, showed up sober, and didn't complain about the cold. That was my crew. We'd work a stand from first light until the sun dropped behind the ridge, then head back to our separate lives without pretending we needed to be friends outside working hours. Winters, when the ground froze hard enough that we couldn't get equipment in without tearing up the contracts, I'd spend my time on Lake Superior. I had an otter shanty I'd haul out onto the ice with my F-250, drive maybe 3 or 4 miles offshore where the lake trout ran deep and cold, and I'd drill my holes and sit in that canvas shelter with a heater going and nothing but frozen water between me and Canada. Some men fish for the catch. I fished for the silence, the kind of quiet that's so complete you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears. And the only thing that matters is whether something's tugging at your line 60 feet below the ice. Friday nights meant Donnelly's, a bar in Marquette with sawdust on the floor and a bartender named Ray, who knew to pour my Leinenkugel the moment my truck pulled into the lot. My crew would meet me there around 7, and we'd drink until 9 or 10, talking about equipment failures and which tracks were coming up for bid, and then I'd drive back to the trailer and sleep the kind of sleep you earn with your body instead of pills. Sundays were for the ice. Always, unless the weather was bad enough that even I couldn't pretend it was safe to be out there. Sharon and I still talked, mostly about our daughter Megan, who was finishing up at Michigan Tech studying forestry of all things. I sent Sharon money every month for Megan's expenses, and sometimes Sharon would call and we'd have these careful conversations where neither of us said anything that mattered, but both of us were trying to figure out if the other person was doing all right. She remarried a guy who sold insurance, and I was happy for her, genuinely. She deserved someone who could sit through dinner conversation without looking at the door. That was my life in January of 2021. 32 years of the same routine, the same trees, the same silence. I was 50 years old, my back hurt most mornings until I got moving, and I could tell you the sound of every saw in my shed just by how it idled. I knew which sections of County Road 510 would try to shake your fillings loose, and which deer trails crossed through my best timber stands. I knew the weight of my Marlin Point 45-70, and how it felt leaning against the truck seat when I was hauling equipment at dawn. What I didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the routine was about to end, and that I'd spend the next 5 years trying to understand what happened in those woods. I'm telling you this now because I need to say it to someone who isn't Sharon or my crew or the bartender at Donnelly's who watches me a little too carefully when she pours my beer. I need to tell it straight through, start to finish. So maybe it'll make sense even though I know it won't. It started with the ravens. I'd been working a 40-acre parcel near the Huron Mountain Club boundary. Good hardwood that would bring decent money once we got it to the mill. We'd been cutting there for 2 weeks when Pete mentioned it first. We were sitting on the tailgate of his pickup eating lunch. Sandwiches from the gas station, coffee from thermoses that never kept anything hot past 9 in the morning. And he said, "You notice how quiet it is?" I told him it was always quiet in the woods in winter. "No," he said, and he had this look on his face like he was trying to work out a problem in his head. "I mean the birds. There aren't any birds." He was right. I hadn't noticed until he said it. But there weren't any ravens mobbing our lunch scraps like they usually did. Those big black bastards would normally be all over us the moment we stopped moving, cawing and fighting over crusts and apple cores, bold as thieves. But that day, there was nothing, just wind moving through bare maple and birch branches and the sound of our own chewing. "Probably moved on," I said, because that's what you say when something's a little off, but not off enough to worry about. "Food source somewhere else." Pete nodded, but he didn't look convinced. And for the rest of that day, I found myself listening for bird sounds that never came. It's funny how you don't notice something until it's gone. The woods were full of winter quiet, sure, but there's supposed to be some noise. Woodpeckers, chickadees, the occasional crow. We had none of that. Just us and our saws and the trees falling in the snow. The deer disappeared next. We'd been logging alongside a game trail for 3 years. One of those deep paths that deer cut through the woods so regular you could set your watch by them. Every morning and evening you'd see us moving through, sometimes a buck, their tracks layered in the snow like a record of their routine. But starting that 3rd week of January, the trail went empty. No tracks, no scat, no sign that anything had used it in days. Danny Salonen thought maybe the wolves had pushed through, scattered the herd. That happened sometimes. A pack would move into an area, and the deer would vanish for a while until they figured out new routes. But I'd been working these woods for 3 decades. And I knew what wolf sign looked like, and this wasn't it. There were tracks, but they were wrong. I found them on a Wednesday out past the work site where I'd walked to check a boundary marker. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, maybe 2 inches, and there was a clear set of prints leading from the tree line toward the creek. They started as whitetail tracks, standard 4-toed deer prints about 3 inches across. I followed them for maybe 20 yards, and then they changed. The stride lengthened, the prints deepened, and the shape shifted into something that made my stomach clench, even though I couldn't have told you why. The 4 toes spread wider, and there was something else in the snow between them. A depression like a thumb or dew claw, but set forward in a way that didn't match any deer I'd ever seen. The gait went from the quick light steps of a whitetail to something heavier, more deliberate. Each print pressed down through the fresh snow into the icy crust beneath. I crouched there in the snow for a long time, just looking at those tracks. The wind was out of the north, and it cut through my Carhartt jacket like I wasn't wearing anything at all. But I didn't feel cold. I felt something else. Something I hadn't felt since I was a kid walking home after dark and convinced something was following me through the trees. That old primal thing that lives in your spine and tells you when you've stopped being the hunter and become something else. I took out my tape measure and checked one of the prints. 7 inches long, maybe 4 across at the widest point. The dew claw mark, if that's what it was, showed clear about 2 inches forward of where a normal canine's would be, and the whole print was pressed deep despite the wind-crusted snow. Whatever had made it was heavy, heavier than a deer, heavier than any wolf I'd ever tracked. And it had started as prey and become something else mid-stride, like it had decided to stop pretending. I remember thinking, bears don't walk like this, wolves don't walk like this. And then I stopped thinking because what was left wasn't anything I wanted to consider. Back at the work site, I found Pete standing next to his saw, just standing there with the engine idling in his hands, staring into the tree line. He didn't move when I walked up, didn't even blink, and I had to say his name twice before he shut the saw down and turned to look at me. "You see something?" I asked. He shook his head, but it took him a few seconds too long to do it. "Just thought I saw movement." "Probably nothing." But his hands were shaking when he set the saw down, and for the rest of that day he kept his back to the trees, working in a way that put the clearing behind him and the woods in his peripheral vision. I didn't mention the tracks. What would I have said? That I'd found prints that changed shape? That something had stopped being a deer and turned into something else while it was walking through the snow? That night at the trailer, I sat on the porch with a beer I didn't drink and listened to the silence. Alberta Creek ran 40 yards from my door, and I could hear the water moving over rocks, the ice breaking and reforming in the current. But there was nothing else. No owls, no coyotes yipping in the distance, no small sounds of animals moving through brush, just the creek, the wind, and a pressure against my eardrums that felt like the silence was something physical, something that was pushing against me, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I went inside and locked the door, which was stupid because the door was aluminum and the lock was something you could pop with a credit card. But I locked it anyway, and I put my Marlin .4 5-70 next to the bed, and I lay there in the dark, listening to nothing until I finally fell asleep sometime after 3 a.m. The woods had gone wrong. I knew it the way you know a fever's coming before your temperature spikes. That deep certainty in your bones that something fundamental has shifted and won't shift back. And the worst part, the part that kept me awake those nights, was that I couldn't tell anyone about it without sounding like I'd lost my mind. I told myself I was being ridiculous, 50 years old and spooked by empty woods like a child afraid of his bedroom closet. Thursday morning, I drove into the tract earlier than usual, while the sky was still that deep blue that comes before dawn. And I walked the perimeter with a flashlight and my Marlin, looking for something concrete. Evidence. Proof that what I was feeling had a rational explanation that didn't involve my mind coming apart at the seams. The tracks were still there from Wednesday, already filling in with wind-blown snow, but visible enough if you knew where to look. I photographed them with my phone, the flash making the snow look blue-white and artificial. In the pictures, they just looked like tracks. Strange tracks, sure, but not the impossible things they'd seemed in person. I told myself that was the cold talking, that I'd been working too long in below-zero temperatures, and my brain wasn't getting enough oxygen. I told myself a lot of things that morning. I measured the stride length between prints. 43 inches. A white-tailed deer runs with a stride of maybe 20 to 30 inches, depending on speed and terrain. Wolves go 30 to 40 in deep snow. Whatever made these tracks was moving with a gait that didn't match anything in my mental catalog of northern Michigan wildlife, and the prints themselves told a story I didn't want to read. The front part of each track showed clear canine characteristics. 4 distinct toe pads, claw marks extending forward. But the rear portion, the heel, was all wrong. Too elongated. Too much weight distributed backward, like something that walked upright part of the time. I knelt in the snow for 20 minutes, taking measurements, writing numbers in a notepad with fingers that had gone numb inside my gloves, trying to make the data add up to something reasonable. A bear walking funny. A wolf with a deformed gait. Some kind of hybrid animal that had wandered down from Canada. I'd heard about coy wolves, eastern coyotes that had bred with wolves, created something new. Maybe this was like that. Maybe some wolf-dog hybrid had gotten loose from someone's property, gone feral, adapted to the woods. But no dog I'd ever seen left tracks that changed shape mid-stride. At Donnelly's that Friday night, I brought it up, careful-like, the way you test thin ice before committing your weight. Pete and Danny were already there when I arrived, nursing beers at our usual table near the back. Marcus came in 10 minutes later, smelling like the cigarettes he swore he'd quit last year. I waited until the second round, until everyone had loosened up enough that my question might seem casual. "You boys ever see tracks you couldn't identify?" I asked. Danny jumped on it like he'd been waiting for someone to ask him about wildlife. All the time. People think they found cougar prints and it's just a big bobcat, or they see coyote tracks and swear it's a wolf. Human brain wants mystery, you know? Wants everything to be special. "What about tracks that start as one thing and change to another?" I said. That got me silence. The kind where everyone's suddenly interested in their beer labels. Pete looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or recognition. Like he'd been wondering when I'd say something. "You talking about those tracks out at the Huron Tract?" Pete said finally. I nodded. 7-inch prints, canine front, but the rear structure's wrong, and the gait doesn't match anything I've seen in 30 years. Marcus shrugged. Bears can leave weird tracks in snow, especially if they're post-holing, breaking through crust. Makes the prints look distorted. "It's January," I said. "Bears are denned up." "Most bears," Danny corrected, "but you get a male sometimes that doesn't den right, stays active through winter. Seen it a few times when winters are mild. Except this winter wasn't mild. This winter had been one of the coldest in a decade, with temperatures dropping below zero for weeks at a time. And I'd seen bear tracks before, knew what a bear's hind foot looked like when it registered in snow, almost human with a long heel and 5 distinct toes. These weren't bear tracks. "What about the deer?" I asked. "The game trail went dead. No tracks, no movement, and the ravens disappeared 3 weeks ago." Pete set his beer down slow, like he was thinking through every word before speaking. "I noticed that too. The birds, I mean. Thought maybe there was something wrong with the ecosystem. Disease, maybe, something pushing the animals out." "Or something hunting them," I said, and regretted it immediately. The silence that followed had weight to it. Danny laughed, but it came out forced. "What? Like a super predator? Come on, Cyrus. You sound like one of those cryptid nuts on the internet." Ray brought our next round without being asked, and the conversation shifted to equipment maintenance and a contract Danny had heard about near Munising. But I caught Pete watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. And later, when we were heading to our trucks, he stopped me in the parking lot. "I saw something," he said quietly. The sodium lights made his face look yellow and sick. 2 days ago, right before quitting time. Something moving through the trees past the northern boundary. Couldn't make out what it was, but it was big. Really big. And it was moving wrong, you know? Not like a deer or a bear, like it was deciding whether to walk on 2 legs or 4. The cold seemed to sink deeper into my bones. "You tell anyone else?" "Who'd I tell?" "Danny. He'd laugh his ass off." "Marcus? He'd probably quit, and we need him for the Ishpeming contract." Pete pulled his truck keys from his pocket, turned them over in his hands. "I'm not crazy, right? You saw something too." "I saw tracks," I said, which was true, and also not nearly the whole truth. "Tracks that don't make sense." "Yeah." Pete looked past me into the dark woods that pressed up against Donnelly's parking lot. "That's what I thought. Tracks that don't make sense. And silence where there shouldn't be silence, and this feeling like something's watching us work every day, waiting for something." "You want to pull out of the contract?" I asked. "We can eat the penalty." He thought about it long enough that I figured he'd say yes, that we'd shake hands and walk away from 40 acres of good hardwood and whatever was living in those trees. But finally he shook his head. "I got bills. Julie's pregnant, we found out last week. I can't afford to walk away from work because I got spooked by some weird tracks and quiet woods." He met my eyes. "But I'm keeping my rifle in the truck from now on, and I'm not working past 4 o'clock when the sun starts dropping." I told him that was smart. I told him we'd all be more careful. And then I watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing down the county road, and I stood in that parking lot for another 10 minutes, trying to convince myself that this would all have a reasonable explanation eventually. Saturday I didn't work. I spent the morning at the hardware store in Marquette, buying batteries for my flashlights and extra ammunition for the Marlin, 300 grain lever evolution rounds that would stop just about anything that walked in North America. The clerk, a kid maybe 20 years old with a sparse beard and a Northern Michigan University sweatshirt, asked if I was hunting bear. "Something like that," I said. "Season's closed," he pointed out, but he rang up the ammo anyway. At home I loaded the Marlin fully for the first time since deer season. 5 rounds in the tube magazine plus 1 in the chamber. I'd always been careful about loaded weapons in the trailer. Sharon used to give me hell about it when we were married, worried about accidents, even though Megan never came out to the trailer. But careful seemed less important than prepared. And I wasn't sure what I was preparing for, but I knew the weight of that loaded rifle made me breathe easier. Sunday I broke my routine. Instead of heading out onto the ice with my shanty and gear, I drove to the tract. Told myself I was checking equipment, making sure the saws were ready for Monday. But really, I was looking for those eyes. I'd seen them Tuesday night, though I hadn't admitted it to anyone, hadn't even fully admitted it to myself. I'd been loading chain into the truck bed around dusk, working later than I should have because we were behind on the cut and I wanted to make up time. The sun had dropped behind the ridge, but there was still that gray light that comes before full dark, enough to see by if you knew the terrain. Ooh. I'd been reaching into the truck bed when something made me stop and turn toward the pressure ridge 50 yards north of the clearing. Not a sound exactly. More like the absence of sound, a pocket of silence that was somehow louder than the wind in the branches. And there they were. 2 points of amber light, maybe 200 yards out along the ridge, 8 feet off the ground. I stood there with one hand still in the truck bed, watching those lights, and they watched back. They didn't move, didn't blink, just held steady in the growing darkness, catching some last bit of daylight and reflecting it back at me in a color that made my hindbrain scream warnings. No bear's eyes were 8 feet off the ground. No wolf's eyes caught light that color. Wolves were green, gold, or yellow, and they were low, close to the earth where wolves belonged. These were wrong in every way that mattered, and they stayed fixed on me for a full minute while my breath came out in clouds and my heart hammered against my ribs. I wanted to move, wanted to reach for the marlin on the truck seat, wanted to do anything except stand there frozen like prey. But my body wouldn't respond. Some old circuit in my brain had taken over, the one that knows sometimes the best defense is absolute stillness. That movement draws attention, and attention means death. The lights blinked. Once. A slow closure of lids over eyes that were too large and set too far apart, and when they opened again they seemed closer somehow, though I would have sworn nothing had moved in the darkness between. And then they were gone, not turning away, but just vanishing, like someone had flipped a switch. I stood in the clearing for another 5 minutes before my body decided it was safe to move again. When I finally climbed into the truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove back to the trailer doing 60 on roads that should have been taken at 35. And I didn't stop shaking until I was inside, with every light on and the door locked and my rifle across my lap. Tuesday night. I'd seen them Tuesday night and spent the next 4 days telling myself they were just eyes, just some animal's eyes, catching light in a way that seemed wrong because of the angle and my exhaustion and the tricks that winter darkness plays on perception. I'd almost convinced myself it was true. But Sunday afternoon, standing in the clearing with full daylight around me and my marlin in my hands, I knew I'd been lying to myself. Those weren't deer eyes, weren't wolf eyes, weren't the eyes of anything that belonged in these woods or any woods I'd ever worked. I walked the perimeter of the work site, checking sight lines, noting where the shadows pooled deepest. The pressure ridge where I'd seen the lights was too far for a clear shot, assuming I'd even know what I was shooting at. The tree line pressed close on 3 sides, thick with black spruce and cedar, the kind of cover where something could watch from 20 feet away and you'd never see it until it wanted to be seen. Near the northern boundary, I found more tracks, these ones fresh from last night's dusting of snow. The same impossible prints, canine front and elongated rear, pressed deep in a line that led from the ridge down into the clearing and then back out again. Whatever made them had come down during the night, walked through our work site like it owned the place, and left. The tracks came within 10 feet of where we'd stacked our equipment, close enough that it could have touched our saws and fuel cans if it wanted to. I crouched next to the clearest print and tried to imagine what would make a track like this. 7 inches long, 4 inches wide, with that strange forward set dew claw that looked almost like a thumb. The weight distribution was all wrong. Too much pressure on the heel, like something that was used to walking upright had temporarily dropped to 4 legs for speed or stealth. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I took more pictures, more measurements, documentation that would prove to exactly no one that I'd found something impossible in the snow. In the photos, they just looked like tracks. Strange, sure, but not supernatural. Not the physical evidence of wrongness that they felt like in person. The sun was dropping behind the trees when I finally headed back to my truck. The shadows stretched long across the clearing and the temperature was falling fast the way it does in January. That sudden drop from cold to bitter that makes your lungs ache. I walked with the marlin cradled in my arms, safety off, finger resting along the trigger guard. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound of wind in branches could have been something else. Something stepping carefully, pacing me through the trees. I was 20 feet from my truck when I saw it. Just a shape, black against the gray-white sky where the trees thinned out along the ridge. But the shape was wrong, and I stopped walking even though every instinct screamed at me to run for the truck, to get metal and glass between me and whatever that was. It stood upright. That was the first thing my brain registered. Stood upright on 2 legs, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. The silhouette showed massive shoulders, broader than any man's, tapering to a narrow waist. The head was wrong, too large and thrust forward on a neck that seemed too thick, and even from 200 yards, I could see that the proportions didn't match anything natural. It stood there against the sky, perfectly still, and I couldn't tell if it was looking at me or not. Couldn't tell anything except that it existed, and that its existence rewrote everything I thought I knew about these woods, about what was possible in northern Michigan, about what stalked the timber stands where I'd worked for 3 decades without ever feeling afraid. I raised the marlin to my shoulder, muscle memory taking over. Got the shape in my sights, finger on the trigger, ready to fire at something I couldn't identify at a distance where I'd likely miss anyway. But I didn't shoot. Something held me back. Not courage, not strategy, just the simple knowledge that shooting would acknowledge what I was seeing, would make it real in a way I wasn't ready to accept. The shape moved, not walking, not exactly. It dropped forward onto 4 legs in a motion that should have been clumsy for something that size, but somehow wasn't. The movement was fluid, practiced, like it had made that transition 1,000 times before, and then it was gone, vanishing into the thick spruce cover at the ridge base, silent as smoke. I stood there with my rifle raised for another minute, maybe 2, watching the spot where it had been, waiting for it to come back, to prove I'd really seen what my eyes claimed I'd seen. But there was nothing now except wind moving through bare branches and the failing light and the pressure of silence that had become the soundtrack to my life. When I finally got to the truck, I sat in the cab with the engine running and the heat blowing and my rifle across my lap, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. 7 feet tall, minimum. Shoulders like a draft horse. Head too large, too animal, but moving between 2 legs and 4 like it couldn't decide which was more comfortable. I wanted to call someone. Pete, maybe, or Sharon. Tell them what I'd seen, get their input, force myself to say the words out loud so my brain would have to deal with the reality of them. But who could I call? What would I say? I saw something in the woods, something that stands like a man but moves like a wolf. I saw an impossible thing and it saw me too, and I think it's been watching us for weeks. They'd think I was losing my mind. Hell, I thought I was losing my mind. But the tracks were real. The eyes had been real. And the shape on the ridge, that had been real too. Solid and physical, casting a shadow in the dying light. This wasn't hallucination or paranoia or some kind of break with reality. Something was out there in the timber, something that didn't belong in any field guide or biology textbook, and it was studying us the way a hunter studies prey. I drove back to the trailer doing 20 miles an hour on roads I could normally navigate blind, my hands locked on the wheel, my eyes checking the rear view every few seconds. The woods pressed close on both sides of the county road, and every shadow between the trees could have been something standing upright, watching my tail lights disappear into the distance. At the trailer, I sat on the porch until my legs started going numb from the cold, the marlin across my knees, listening to Alberta Creek and the silence beyond it. No owls, no coyotes, no small sounds of life in the winter darkness, just the water and the wind and the certainty that I was being observed from somewhere in that blackness, that something was out there keeping track of my routines and movements, learning me the way I'd spent 30 years learning these woods. And the worst part, the part that made my hands shake when I finally went inside and locked the door, was that I had no idea what it wanted or why it was here or what it would do next. I only knew that the wrongness had a shape now and a size, and that it moved between the trees like a thing that had every right to be there, like it had been here long before I arrived, and would be here long after I left. If I left, I loaded every firearm I owned that night, kept them within reach, while I sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee I didn't need, and staring at the photographs on my phone. In the pictures, the shape on the ridge was just a dark blur. Could have been a stump or a shadow or anything at all. No proof, no evidence. Just my word that I'd seen something impossible, and my word wasn't worth much these days, not even to myself. Monday morning would come in a few hours. My crew would show up expecting to work, and I'd have to decide whether to tell them what I'd seen or keep quiet and hope that whatever was out there would stay in the shadows where it belonged. Either way, I knew with absolute certainty that something had changed in those woods, and that the man who'd spent 32 years cutting timber without fear was someone I couldn't be anymore. The silence pressed against the trailer walls. I sat with my rifle and my coffee and waited for dawn, knowing that daylight wouldn't make any of this better, but hoping, God, I was hoping, that it might at least make it feel less impossible than it did in the dark hours before sunrise, when every sound outside could be something walking upright, coming closer. Learning. Monday morning came gray and cold, the kind of dawn where the sun doesn't so much rise as the darkness just gets lighter. I hadn't slept. Couldn't. Every time I'd closed my eyes, I'd seen that shape on the ridge, that impossible silhouette that moved wrong. And my brain kept trying to make it make sense, kept trying to fit it into categories I understood: bear, wolf, man. But the pieces wouldn't go together no matter how I arranged them. The crew showed up at 6:30. Pete's truck first, Then Danny's Silverado with Marcus riding shotgun, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom like nothing in the world had changed. I watched them from the trailer porch, the marlin still across my knees where it'd been all night, and I tried to figure out how to say what needed saying. Pete climbed out first, saw me sitting there with the rifle, and stopped mid-step. "Boss, everything okay?" I stood up slow, my legs stiff from hours of sitting. "No," I said, "it's not." They gathered on the porch while I told them what I'd seen. Not everything I left out, the part about the tracks changing mid-stride, the part about the silence that felt like pressure. But enough. Something big in the woods. Something that stood upright. Something that had been watching us work. Danny laughed first, then saw my face and stopped. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." "Boss," Marcus said carefully, "you been drinking?" "Stone sober, wish I wasn't." I picked up my phone, showed them the photos even though they proved nothing. "I know how it sounds. I know what you're thinking. But something's out there. And it's not a bear, and it's not wolves. And I need you to trust me on this." The silence that followed wasn't the silence of the woods. This was men thinking, calculating, weighing what they knew about me against what I was telling them. Pete broke it finally. "The ravens," he said, "and the deer? Something's been wrong for weeks." "Yeah." "So what do we do?" Danny asked. "Call the DNR? Get a hunter in here with dogs?" I'd thought about that all night. "And tell them what? That I saw something weird? They'll think I'm crazy or looking for attention or—" I stopped. "We worked the site today together. Nobody goes anywhere alone. We keep the trucks close, and we keep our eyes open." "You're still going out there," Marcus said, "after what you saw?" "I got a contract to fulfill. Got payroll to meet." I looked at each of them. "I'm not asking you to come if you don't want to. No hard feelings. But I got to go back out there, and I'd rather not do it alone." They looked at each other. That wordless communication men who've worked together develop. Then Pete nodded. "All right, but we bring guns. Real ones, not just the .22 for pine martens." "Already loaded mine," Danny said. We drove out in convoy, 3 trucks with rifles in the racks, and I tried to tell myself it was paranoia, that we were overreacting to shadows and fear and my own exhaustion. But when we turned onto the access road and the woods closed in around us, that silence was waiting. No birds, no squirrels chattering, just the engine noise and our breath fogging in the cold air. The work site looked exactly as we'd left it Friday afternoon. The Husqvarna saws lined up on the tailgate, the fuel cans, the felling wedges and chains. Normal, ordinary. But the snow around the perimeter showed tracks. Lots of them, crisscrossing and circling, like something had spent the weekend pacing the clearing's edge. "Jesus," Pete said, crouching next to a print. "What is that?" I already knew what it was. 4 toes, canine configuration, but too long and with that dew claw set wrong, pressed deep into the frozen crust. And they were fresh, maybe a few hours old, the edges still sharp. "It was here last night," I said, after I left. Marcus had his Winchester out, scanning the tree line. "It's watching us right now. I can feel it." He was right. I could feel it too, that weight of observation, that sense of being studied. The thing I'd seen on the ridge hadn't left. It was close, somewhere in the spruce and cedar that pressed in on 3 sides of our clearing, and it knew we were here. We worked anyway because what else could we do? But everything was different now. We kept the trucks in a tight cluster, engines running. Nobody wandered off to piss without telling someone. We worked in pairs, one cutting while the other watched the tree line. The chainsaws screamed and whined, filling the silence with noise that should have been comforting but wasn't, because every time we shut them down to move or refuel, that pressing quiet came rushing back in. Around 10 o'clock, Danny called out, his voice tight. "Boss, over here." He'd found them in a stand of birch maybe 50 yards from where we were cutting. Deer carcasses. 3 of them, white-tail does, arranged in a line like they'd been placed there deliberately. But that wasn't the worst part. They'd been partially eaten, the rib cages torn open and organs removed with precision I'd never seen from any predator. Bears were messy feeders. Wolves scattered kills, dragged pieces away. This was different. The deer had been opened carefully, almost surgically, and whatever had done it had eaten specific parts, hearts, livers, kidneys, leaving the rest. And the tracks around them weren't normal either. They showed something moving on 2 legs, circling the carcasses, kneeling beside them. The prints where it had knelt showed a weight distribution that made my stomach clench. Whatever this thing was, it could stand upright for extended periods. It wasn't a bear occasionally rearing up. It lived that way, moved that way, hunted that way. "We should go," Marcus said. His voice had gone flat, that tone men get when fear turns into something harder. "Right now? Leave the equipment, file an insurance claim, I don't care, but we should not be here." I wanted to agree. God, I wanted to. But looking at those carcasses, at the deliberate way they'd been arranged, I understood something that made my hands go cold inside my gloves. "It left these here for us to find," I said. "This is a message." "What kind of message?" Pete asked. "The kind that says it knows we're here, that it's been watching, that it's—" I stopped, because the word I was thinking was impossible, but it was the only word that fit. "It's claiming territory. These deer are a boundary marker." "Boundary of what?" "Of its hunting ground." I looked at the tree line, at the shadows between the trunks. "And we're in it." We loaded the equipment without finishing the cut. Nobody argued. The deer carcasses sat in their neat line like an exhibit in a museum, and we gave them wide berth on the way back to the trucks. I took photos with my phone, though I knew they wouldn't show what mattered. The intelligence behind the arrangement. The deliberate nature of the display. Driving back toward the county road, Pete's truck leading and mine bringing up the rear, I kept checking my mirrors. The woods looked empty, just winter timber and snow and gray sky showing through bare branches. But I knew it was there, watching us leave, probably following along through the trees, pacing our convoy, tracking our movements. We made it maybe half a mile before Marcus's voice crackled over the radio we used for coordinating work. "Truck's not running right." Danny's Silverado started losing power, the engine coughing and sputtering. He pulled over and popped the hood while Pete and I idled behind him. And I felt my throat go tight, because stopping here, in this narrow corridor of road, with woods pressing close on both sides, felt like exactly what we shouldn't be doing. Danny spent 5 minutes checking hoses and connections before he found it. "Fuel line's been cut. Clean cut, like someone took a knife to it." "That's impossible," Pete said. "Truck was running fine on the way in." But it wasn't impossible. I thought about the tracks circling our work site, about the hours between when I'd left Saturday and when we'd arrived Monday morning. Thought about something moving through the darkness with human intelligence and animal stealth, learning our vehicles, understanding how they worked. It got to the truck, I said. While we were looking at the deer. Marcus climbed out of the cab, his Winchester held across his chest. You're saying that thing knows about engines? I didn't answer because I didn't want to say what I was thinking. That whatever this was, it was smarter than we'd given it credit for. Smart enough to disable a vehicle. Smart enough to separate us. Make us vulnerable. We towed Danny's Silverado back to the work site using chains and Pete's truck, because going forward meant another 6 miles of woods and going back meant only 1. By the time we got there, it was almost noon, the sun barely above the tree line, and that silence had gotten deeper somehow, more complete. I'm calling someone, Danny said, pulling out his phone. Then, no signal. I checked mine. Same. The terrain around the work site had always been spotty for coverage. Too many ridges, too much distance from the nearest tower. We'd had 3 bars that morning on the drive in, but that was higher ground. We'll have to drive out to get signal, I said. Pete was looking at the tree line again, his hand white-knuckled on his rifle. It broke the truck. It wants us stuck here. That's crazy, Danny said, but nobody disagreed with him. We used my truck to drive Danny out to where he could get a signal and call for a tow. That left Pete and Marcus at the work site with strict instructions to stay in the truck, keep the doors locked, and shoot anything that came out of the woods. The drive took 40 minutes, and for every one of those minutes, I kept thinking about my crew back there, about that thing circling them, about how I'd left them vulnerable. Danny got through to a tow service in Marquette that could come out in 2 hours. He'd left his red Carhartt jacket in the Silverado. Said he'd grab it when he picked up the truck from the shop. I left him at a gas station on M35 and drove back fast enough that my truck fishtailed on the patches of ice. Fear making me reckless. I found Pete and Marcus exactly where I'd left them, in Pete's truck with the engine running and all the windows up. But something had changed. I could see it in their faces before I even stopped. It came out, Marcus said when I climbed in beside them. 10 minutes after you left. Stood right there. He pointed to a spot maybe 30 yards away at the edge of the clearing near a lightning-struck cedar. Did you see it? Not clearly, it stayed in the shadows. But it was big, boss. Bigger than any bear, and it stood on 2 legs the whole time, didn't drop to 4 once. Just stood there watching us for maybe 5 minutes, then turned and walked back into the trees. Walked like a man walking, but the shape was wrong. Pete's hands were shaking. I had my rifle up. I had a clear shot. But I couldn't pull the trigger. Why not? Because... He stopped, shook his head. Because it knew I had it pointed at it, and it didn't care. It just stood there, calm as anything. And I had the feeling that if I shot at it, if I missed, or even if I hit it, things would get worse. Does that make sense? It did. God help me, it did. Because I'd felt the same thing Saturday evening. That sense that shooting would be a mistake, would escalate something that was better left alone. Did it do anything else? Yeah, Marcus said. It left something. They showed me on Marcus's phone. A video he'd shot through the truck window. His hands shaking so bad the footage was almost unusable. But I could see it. A dark shape at the tree line. Easily 7 feet tall, upright, and somehow wrong in ways the camera couldn't quite capture. And at the 30-second mark, it stepped forward just enough that sunlight caught its arm as it placed something on a stump at the clearing's edge. Then it turned and walked away, and the footage ended. What did it leave? I asked. Haven't checked yet. waiting for you. We approached the stump together, all three of us armed, moving like soldiers in hostile territory. And there, placed carefully on the flat surface, was my spare work glove, the one I kept on my trailer porch for when I checked the propane tank, the one that had been there yesterday when I'd left for the motel. "It's been to your place," Pete said quietly. "It knows where you live." I picked up the glove, and that's when I saw what had been done to it. 4 holes punched through the fingertips, ragged and deliberate, like something with claws had pushed through the fabric. Not torn, pushed through carefully, testing. "It was trying it on," Marcus said quietly. "Jesus Christ, it was trying to wear your glove." I turned the glove over, and that's when my stomach dropped. Because on the palm, pressed into the leather with something dark that might have been mud or might have been blood, was a perfect handprint. 5 fingers, a thumb, a palm with lines and whorls like a human hand, but bigger. Wrong proportions. The thumb sat different. "We need to leave," Pete said. "Right now. Forget the equipment, forget the contract, forget all of it. That thing is studying us. It's learning us. And whatever it's planning to do with what it's learning, we don't want to be here when it does it." He was right. Every instinct I had was screaming the same thing, but I thought about the 40 acres of timber we'd contracted to cut, about the payments I'd committed to, about the crew's wages and the equipment loans and all the normal concerns of running a business. And I thought about how those concerns meant nothing now, how they'd been made irrelevant by whatever was out there in the woods, wearing my glove like it was practicing to be human. "We go when the tow truck comes," I said. "We get Danny's Silverado sorted, and then we're done. No more work here. I'll eat the contract costs." "What about tomorrow?" Marcus asked. "Next week, where do we work then?" I looked at the handprint on my glove, at those wrong proportions, and I understood something that had been creeping up on me since Saturday. This thing, whatever it was, had claimed these woods, had marked them as its territory as surely as wolves marked their range, and we'd been working here for 3 weeks, cutting trees, making noise, living our human lives in the middle of its hunting ground. "I don't know," I said, "but not here? Never here again?" We waited in the trucks with the engines running and the heaters blasting and every door locked. Marcus kept the video on his phone, playing it over and over, trying to see details that the camera hadn't captured. Pete sat with his rifle across his lap, staring at the tree line. And I held my glove, that ruined glove with its punctured fingers and impossible handprint, and tried not to think about what it meant that something in these woods was curious about human clothing. The tow truck arrived at 3:30 just as the light was starting to fail. The driver was a guy named Ray Tompkins, who'd gone to high school with Sharon, and he took one look at our faces and stopped cracking jokes about weekend hunters. "You boys okay?" he asked. "Fine," I said. "Just get that Silverado loaded so we can get out of here." He hooked up Danny's truck, and we formed a convoy heading out. Ray's tow truck first, then Pete, then me bringing up the rear again. And as we pulled away from that clearing, as the work site disappeared behind us, around the first curve in the access road, I looked in my rear view mirror one last time. It was standing in the middle of the clearing, upright, motionless, watching us leave. I couldn't see details at that distance, just a shape that was too tall and too dark and fundamentally wrong in ways that made my eyes hurt to look at directly. But I saw enough, saw the size of it, saw how it stood with that forward-leaning posture that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal, saw how it made no move to hide or follow, just stood there, like it was content to let us go because It knew we'd never really leave. Not completely, not after what we'd seen. Then the road curved and the trees blocked my view, and I was left with just the memory of that shape and the handprint on my glove, and the certainty that something had changed in my understanding of the world, something that couldn't be changed back. Couldn't be. We made it to M35 without incident. Ray dropped Danny's truck at Marquette Automotive and headed back to town. My crew gathered in the gas station parking lot, their trucks idling, breath fogging in the cold air. "So what now?" Danny asked. "Now we figure out where we can work." "That isn't here," I said. "I'll make some calls, see who's got contracts down near Escanaba or Gladstone. Somewhere." I stopped. "Somewhere else." "You really think it'll stay in those woods?" Marcus asked. "You think it's territorial enough that we're safe once we're outside its range?" I thought about the handprint, about the way it had tested my glove, pushing claws through the fingertips like it was trying to understand how human hands worked, about the intelligence in how it had arranged those deer carcasses, in how it had disabled Danny's truck, in how it had waited until I left before showing itself to Pete and Marcus. "I don't know," I said, "but I'm not going back to find out." They nodded, and I could see relief in their faces mixed with something harder. Shame, maybe, that we were running from something we couldn't explain or understand. Northern Michigan men don't run. We endure. We persist. But this was different. This was a wrongness too big to endure, too dangerous to persist against. "Get some sleep," I said. "I'll call you tomorrow about new work." They drove off in different directions, and I sat alone in the gas station parking lot with my truck running and my glove on the passenger seat, and the weight of what we'd seen pressing down on me like water. I should have felt relieved. We'd gotten out. Nobody was hurt. The thing in the woods had let us leave. But all I felt was watched. I took out my phone and looked at the photos I'd taken. The tracks, the deer carcasses, the handprint on my glove. In the photos, they looked like evidence of something, proof that would make people believe. But I knew they proved nothing. Just shadows and shapes and marks in snow that could be explained away by anyone who wanted to. The gas station clerk was watching me through the window, probably wondering why I was sitting there with my truck running, going nowhere. I put the phone away and pulled out of the parking lot, heading not toward my trailer but toward town, toward lights and people and the sounds of human life. I couldn't go back to Alberta Creek, not tonight, maybe not ever. Because the trailer sat too close to the woods, too isolated, too perfect for something that was learning how humans lived, studying their homes and vehicles and clothing. I checked into a motel on the south side of Marquette, a place called the Northern Lights Inn that was mostly empty this time of year. The clerk barely looked up when I paid cash for a week. The room was on the second floor, with windows facing the parking lot, and I checked them twice to make sure they locked before I sat on the bed with my rifle beside me and tried to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. Because this wasn't over. I knew that the way you know when a storm is coming, that deep certainty that something has been set in motion that won't stop until it reaches some kind of conclusion. The thing in the woods had studied us, had watched us work for weeks, had learned our routines and our vehicles and maybe even our names if it could understand human speech. And it had let us go, but not because it was afraid or because we'd driven it off. It had let us go because we weren't important enough yet, because we weren't the goal, just part of the learning process. I thought about the handprint on my glove, about those 5 fingers that were almost right but not quite, and I tried not to think about what would happen when it finished learning, when it had studied enough, when it decided to do something with all that accumulated knowledge about how humans lived and worked and moved through the world. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The images kept coming, playing behind my eyes every time I blinked. That shape on the ridge, that silhouette in the clearing, those amber eyes reflecting light at impossible heights. And worse, the carcasses arranged in their neat line, the fuel line cut with precision, my glove taken and tested and returned. It was out there right now in those woods, doing whatever it did when humans weren't watching, learning, growing bolder, getting ready for something I couldn't begin to imagine, but that I knew with absolute certainty would be worse than anything we'd seen so far. I turned on every light in the motel room and sat with my back against the headboard, rifle across my lap, and watched the parking lot through the window until dawn came gray and cold and useless, bringing daylight that did nothing to make any of this better. Nothing to make the fear less real. Nothing to change the fact that I'd seen something impossible, and it had seen me too. And there was no going back from that, no pretending it hadn't happened, no way to unknow what I now knew about the things that lived in the old woods watching. I called Pete at dawn from the motel room, my voice hoarse from not sleeping. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been waiting. "We need to go back," I said. Silence on the other end then. "The hell we do?" "My trailer's there. All my equipment. I can't just abandon everything." "Boss, that thing, I know what it is. That's why we go during daylight. Load up what matters and leave for good. You don't have to come. I'll understand." Another silence, longer this time. Then, "What time?" "Noon. Full sun. We take 2 trucks in case one breaks down." "Cyrus?" Pete's voice was tight. "What if it's still there?" "Then we leave fast." "But I need my equipment, Pete. I need the title papers from the trailer, the logging permits, the insurance documents. I can't start over without them." He agreed finally, and I called Marcus next. Got his voicemail? Left a message saying the same thing. Didn't hear back. Couldn't blame him. "Danny, I didn't even try." He'd made his position clear when his Silverado left rubber pulling out of that gas station. At 11:30, I checked out of the Northern Lights Inn and drove to Pete's place on the west side of town. He was waiting in his yard with his truck already running, a rifle case visible through the rear window. His wife Julie stood on the porch with her arms crossed, and when I pulled up, she gave me a look that could have stripped paint. "You bring him back," she said. "Not a request." "Yes, ma'am." Pete climbed into his truck without saying goodbye to her, and we headed north toward Alberta Creek, with the winter sun doing its best to warm air that didn't want warming. The roads were clear, but the woods on either side pressed close, and I couldn't help scanning the tree line, looking for movement, for shapes that didn't belong. We took it slow, Pete following 50 yards behind me, and when we turned onto the logging road that led to my tract, I felt my hands tighten on the wheel hard enough to hurt. The road was empty. No tracks except mine from days ago, mostly drifted over. No disturbance in the snow. Just that terrible silence I'd come to know too well. My trailer sat where I'd left it, intact, windows unbroken. But something felt wrong about it, the way a room feels wrong when someone's been through your things, even if they put everything back in place. Pete pulled up beside me, and we both sat there with our engines running, neither of us wanting to be first out of a vehicle. "You see anything?" he called through his open window. "No, but that doesn't mean it's not here. Could be watching. It's always watching." We got out together, rifles in hand, and approached the trailer like it might explode. I unlocked the door and it swung open on hinges that didn't squeak, revealing my kitchen exactly as I'd left it. Coffee cup in the sink, newspaper on the table, everything normal and wrong all at once. "I'm going to grab the file cabinet from the bedroom," I said. "Keep watch." Pete positioned himself facing the woods, his Remington 700 up and ready while I went inside. The trailer smelled stale, closed up. I moved quick through the narrow hallway to the bedroom and hauled the filing cabinet out. 30 pounds of paperwork that represented everything official about my business. Back through the kitchen, out the door, into the truck bed. Pete hadn't moved, was still scanning the tree line. "Clothes," I said, "then tools." I made 3 more trips. Duffel bag of clothes, my good chainsaw, the toolbox from under the trailer. Pete stayed outside the whole time, and I could see the tension in his shoulders. The way his head kept moving, checking angles, watching for movement. On my last trip, I grabbed the photos from the bedroom wall. Me and Megan at her high school graduation. One of Sharon from before the divorce. An old picture of my father in front of his timber rig. Stupid, maybe, to risk it for photographs. But they were mine, and I wasn't leaving them. I was coming out the door with the photos when Pete said, "Cyrus," in a voice that made my blood stop. He was looking toward the work site, toward the clearing where we'd been cutting. His rifle was up but not aimed, like he couldn't decide what to point it at. I followed his gaze. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 80 yards away in full daylight, making no attempt to hide. 7.5 feet tall, upright. Broad shoulders narrowing to a waist too thin for something that size, then powerful legs bent wrong, digitigrade like a dog's, but supporting all that weight on 2 feet. The head was massive, elongated, a wolf's skull stretched and enlarged until the proportions became nightmarish. Dark gray-brown fur covered everything, thicker at the neck and shoulders. And in the noon sun, I could see the muscle moving underneath, see the way it shifted its weight from foot to foot. Its arms hung at its sides, too long, ending in those hands I'd seen the print of. 5 fingers. Black claws, the hands opened and closed slowly, deliberately, like it was testing their function. But the worst part, the detail that made my stomach drop, was what it was wearing. Danny's work jacket, the red Carhartt with the tear in the left sleeve, the one he'd left in his Silverado. The tow truck must have stopped somewhere along the way, or maybe the thing had followed the convoy out. Patient as death, waiting for its chance. It hung on the thing's frame all wrong, too small, arms not through the sleeves, but with the jacket draped across its shoulders like it was trying to understand the concept of clothing. "Jesus Christ," Pete whispered. The thing cocked its head at the sound of his voice. The motion was too precise, too controlled. Not an animal's startled reaction, but a person's deliberate choice to listen more carefully. Then it took a step forward. "Get in the truck," I said. "It's got Danny's. Get in the goddamn truck." We backed toward our vehicles, rifles up, watching it. It took another step. Then another. Not rushing, not charging, just walking toward us with the patient confidence of something that knew we couldn't escape if it decided we shouldn't. The jacket slipped from its shoulders and fell into the snow. It didn't look down, didn't pause, just kept coming. Cyrus, we need to shoot it. And if we miss or just piss it off, we can't just... It dropped to all fours, and the change was instant, horrifying. On four legs, it was no longer pretending to be anything but what it was. A predator, designed to run down prey, to close distance, to kill. The way it moved was fluid as water, muscle and bone working together with terrible efficiency. Pete fired. The crack of his rifle split the silence, and I saw the thing flinch. Saw snow kick up where the round hit dirt behind it. A miss. It didn't stop, didn't slow, just kept coming with a loping gait that ate up ground too fast. I raised my Marlin, but Pete was between me and it, and I couldn't get a clean angle. "Move," I shouted, and Pete stumbled backward toward his truck. 40 yards, 30. I could hear it now, hear the breath pumping in and out, hear its claws hitting frozen ground. Pete reached his truck and yanked the door open, and it launched itself forward, closing the last 20 yards in 3 bounds. I fired. The 45-70 kicked against my shoulder, and the slug caught it mid-leap, high on the shoulder, spinning it sideways. It hit the ground hard, rolled, came up already moving but limping now, one front leg not working right. It looked at me then, really looked, and I saw in those amber eyes something worse than animal rage. I saw calculation, assessment, a mind working behind those eyes, figuring angles, measuring threats. Pete fired again from inside his truck, his round punching through the thing's side, and it coughed. That awful sound between animal and human, and turned away from us, loping 3-legged back toward the tree line. I fired twice more at its retreating form, missed both times, and then it was gone into the spruce like it had never been there. Except Danny's jacket still lay in the snow, and the tracks were there, deep gouges in the frozen ground where its claws had dug in, and blood steamed in 3 separate places, dark red against white. "Drive," Pete said. His voice was shaking. "Cyrus, we need to drive now." I climbed into my truck and we left, both vehicles fishtailing on the logging road, neither of us caring about the equipment still sitting by the trailer, about the file cabinet bouncing in my truck bed. We just drove, windows up, doors locked, rifles across our laps, and we didn't slow down until we hit pavement. Pete followed me all the way back to Marquette, wouldn't let me out of his sight. And when we pulled into a sit-go station on the edge of town, he got out of his truck and came to my window. "What was that thing?" "I don't know." "It was wearing Danny's jacket, Cyrus. It took his jacket and put it on." "I know." "How does that happen? How does something like that exist?" I didn't have an answer. Still don't. Pete stood there waiting for me to explain the unexplainable, to make sense of what couldn't make sense, and finally he just shook his head. "I'm done logging," he said. "Julie's been after me to take that foreman job at the mill. I'm going to take it." "That's smart." "What about you?" "I don't know yet." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded and walked back to his truck. I watched him drive away, headed toward his house and his wife and his normal life, that maybe could still be normal if he just didn't think about what he'd seen. I sat in the sit-go parking lot until the clerk came out and asked if I needed help. Told him no, I was fine, I was leaving. But I sat there another hour anyway, watching the woods across the highway, watching for movement, for shapes, for amber eyes reflecting light. My phone rang. Sharon. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Cyrus, Megan said you weren't answering her calls." Been busy? She's worried about you. Said you sounded strange last time she talked to you. I'm fine. You're not fine. I know you. What happened? And God help me, I almost told her. Almost explained about the thing in the woods, about Danny's jacket, about the intelligence in those eyes. But what would be the point? She'd think I was drinking again, or crazy, or both. Just work trouble, I said. Lost a contract. Is it money? Because Megan said, it's not money. I'm fine, Sharon. Tell Megan I'll call her tomorrow. I hung up before she could push harder, before I said something I couldn't take back. The hospital was 2 miles away. I drove there and told the ER nurse I'd fallen, that I was feeling off, that I needed to be checked. She was someone I'd known in high school, Lisa Peterson, and the way she looked at me said she knew I was lying. But she took me back anyway. They checked my vitals, asked questions I half answered, gave me something for anxiety that I didn't take. Lisa brought me coffee and sat down in the plastic chair beside the examination table. What really happened, Cyrus? I fell. You're not injured, you're not sick, you're terrified. I can see it. I looked at her and saw genuine concern in her face, saw that she really wanted to help, and I knew there was nothing she could do, nothing anyone could do. I saw something, I said finally. Out in the woods, something that shouldn't exist. Like what? I can't explain it. You'd think I was crazy. Try me. So I did. Not everything, but enough. About the silence, about the tracks, about the thing that stood upright and wore clothing. I watched her face while I talked. Watched the concern shift to confusion to something like pity. Have you been drinking? She asked gently. No. Cyrus, I'm going to have someone talk to you, a counselor, because what you're describing, forget it. I stood up. I shouldn't have said anything. Please sit down. You're clearly under stress. We can help. But I was already leaving, walking past the nurse's station, through the waiting room, out to my truck where the file cabinet sat in the bed and my rifle lay across the back seat, and everything was exactly as wrong as it had been before. I didn't go back to the motel, didn't go back to the trailer. I drove south out of Marquette with no particular destination, just putting distance between myself and the Huron Mountains, between myself and the thing that had studied me like I was a textbook it needed to understand. Found myself in Escanaba 3 hours later, a town I'd worked near years ago but never lived in. Checked into a Holiday Inn and sat in the room with my rifle beside me and tried to figure out what the hell to do with the rest of my life. Because I couldn't go back to logging, not up north, not in those old woods. Couldn't go back to the trailer even if I wanted to. Couldn't explain to anyone what I'd seen without sounding insane. Couldn't unknow what I knew about what lived in the timber stands around the Huron Mountains. I thought about calling the DNR, thought about calling the sheriff, thought about calling someone official and making a report. But what would I report? That I'd seen a Dogman? That it wore human clothing? They'd check my record, see the DUI from back when the marriage fell apart, assume I was drinking again. Or they'd send someone up to investigate, find nothing, and I'd be the crazy logger who saw monsters. Pete understood because Pete had seen it too. But Pete was done, had chosen to walk away, to take his mill job and pretend it hadn't happened. And I couldn't blame him. That was the smart choice, the sane choice. I took out my phone and pulled up the photos I'd taken, the tracks, the carcasses, the handprint on my glove. Looked at them for a long time. Then I deleted them one by one. I thought about Marcus's video, the one he'd shot through the truck window, Asked him to delete it too that same night. He said he already had. Said he couldn't stand to look at it until there was no evidence left except my memory and Danny's jacket lying in the snow and blood that would melt with the spring thaw. Around midnight, I called Marcus. Got his voicemail again. It's Cyrus. I'm shutting down the operation, selling the equipment. You want first pick, call me back. Otherwise, I'll put it on Craigslist. Take care of yourself. Hung up before I said anything else, anything about why we were really done, about what we'd all seen and weren't talking about. The next morning, I called Sharon from a diner on the waterfront. Told her I was moving downstate, that I'd sold my contracts and was starting over. What happened up there? She asked. Nothing I can explain. Cyrus, you're scaring me. I'm fine. I just need a change. I'll be closer to Megan this way, can visit more. That seemed to satisfy her, or at least she pretended it did. We talked about logistics, about the trailer, about whether I needed help moving. I told her I had it handled, that I'd be in touch once I was settled. The thing was, I didn't have anything handled. I was adrift in a way I hadn't been since the divorce, since the DUI, since the worst year of my life. But this was different. This wasn't depression or drinking or a failed marriage. This was knowing something true and terrible that I couldn't share, couldn't prove, couldn't escape. I spent 2 weeks in Escanaba, sleeping poorly, eating less, watching the woods beyond the hotel parking lot, like the thing might follow me down here. Paranoid, maybe. But paranoia implies irrational fear, and there was nothing irrational about being afraid of something that had demonstrated intelligence, patience, and physical power beyond anything human. Found work finally through an old contact. A commercial operation cutting plantation pine down near Manastique. Young trees, neat rows. Nothing wild about it. Nothing old enough to hold secrets. The work was boring, but the routine helped. Gave me something to focus on besides the memory of amber eyes and 5-fingered hands and that awful coughing sound. I rented an apartment above a bait shop in town, 2nd floor, windows, facing the street where I could see cars and people and normal life happening. Sold most of my equipment cheap. Kept only what I needed for the new work. The trailer I abandoned. Told the landowner he could have it considerate payment for 3 months unpaid rent. Didn't go back to get the rest of my things. Didn't want to know if something had moved into the trailer after I left, if it was still there. Studying the coffee cup in the sink, the newspaper on the table, learning more about how humans lived. Pete called once, about a month after it happened. His voice sounded strained. You doing okay? Getting by. You. Julie thinks I should see someone, a therapist. Says I've been having nightmares. Have you? Every night. You? Yeah. Silence on the line, comfortable almost. 2 people who'd seen the same impossible thing and didn't need to explain it to each other. I told the mill I needed time off, Pete said. Can't seem to focus on the work. Keep looking over my shoulder. That gets better. I lied. Does it? I don't know. Maybe. We talked a few more minutes about nothing important, then hung up with vague promises to stay in touch that we both knew we wouldn't keep. Because talking to Pete meant remembering, and remembering hurt in a way that physical pain didn't. I saw Megan that spring. Drove down to Green Bay where she was teaching 3rd grade. She'd gotten her own apartment, was dating a guy named Scott who worked in IT, and she seemed happy in a way that made me ache with something like envy. Her life was normal, simple, uncomplicated by knowledge of things that shouldn't exist. We had dinner at a brew pub downtown, and she kept asking why I'd moved, why I'd changed operations, what had really happened up north. I gave her the same story I'd given Sharon. Needed a change, wanted to be closer to family. The old work was getting too hard on my back. She didn't believe me. I could see it in her face. Dad, you look like you've seen a ghost. Just tired, honey. New job's an adjustment. Mom said you sounded weird when you called her. Said you seemed scared. Your mom worries too much. Do you remember when I was little and I had that nightmare about something in the closet? You told me that monsters weren't real, that there was nothing in the dark that wasn't there in the light. I remembered. She'd been 6, terrified, convinced something lived in her closet. Did you lie to me? She asked. Back then, did you lie? I looked at my daughter across the table, 24 years old, smart enough to know when her father was hiding something, and I made a choice. Yeah, I said, I lied. I'm sorry. Her face went pale. What are you saying? I'm saying the world's bigger and stranger than we like to think. I'm saying there are things in the old places that we don't understand. I'm saying be careful in the woods, and if you see something that doesn't make sense, don't try to figure it out. Just leave. You're scaring me. Good. You should be scared. Not paralyzed, not paranoid, just aware, the way your ancestors were aware, the way people used to be before we convinced ourselves we'd tamed everything wild. Scott came back from the bathroom then, and the moment passed, and we spent the rest of dinner making small talk about her students, about the Packers, about anything except what we'd almost discussed. But when I hugged her goodbye in the parking lot, she held on longer than usual. Be careful, she whispered. You too, honey. 5 years now, since that January morning when I saw it wearing Danny's jacket. 5 years since I fired 3 shots into something that shouldn't exist and watched it limp back into the spruce. 5 years of sleeping with lights on, of working only daylight hours, of choosing young timber over old, of never fishing again, of checking my rearview mirror more than the road ahead. I'm 55 now, still running the crew down near Manistee, still cutting plantation pine in neat rows. My apartment above the bait shop is small, but it's got good locks and faces the street, and I can hear people moving around below me at night. Their voices a comfort against the silence that used to press down on my trailer at Alberta Creek. Pete sent a Christmas card last year. He'd moved to Wisconsin, taken a job doing carpentry, completely left the woods. The card had a photo of him and Julie and their daughter, all smiling, all looking like people who slept well at night. I was happy for him, really. Marcus I never heard from again. Danny neither. Sometimes I wonder if they saw it too, if they've spent these 5 years trying to forget the same things I can't forget. Or maybe they didn't see enough, didn't get close enough, and they've moved on with their lives, without the weight of impossible knowledge. I don't date. Can't seem to make myself vulnerable enough to let someone close. Sharon asked once, gentle, if I was lonely, and I told her I was fine with my own company. Didn't mention that being alone was better than having someone else to worry about. Someone else the thing in the woods might study if it ever decided to expand its understanding of humans beyond isolated men in trailers. Some nights I dream about it, about those amber eyes reflecting light, about the intelligence behind them, about the way it had arranged those deer carcasses and disabled Danny's truck and taken my glove to study, about the way it wore that jacket, trying to understand the concept of clothing, of human tools and protection. And I wonder what it knows now, what it's learned in 5 years, Whether it's still up there in the Huron Mountains, watching other crews, studying other loggers, accumulating knowledge about human behavior and technology and vulnerabilities, or whether it's moved on, grown bolder, started testing its knowledge in populated areas where there are more humans to learn from, more opportunities to study the species that had intruded on its territory. I don't talk about it anymore. Learned my lesson at the hospital with Lisa Peterson, saw how quickly concern became pity, became diagnosis. The world doesn't want to believe in monsters, doesn't want to acknowledge that there are still wild places beyond our understanding, still predators that make us prey. But I know. Pete knows. Somewhere, maybe Danny and Marcus know too. And we carry that knowledge like a stone in our chest, heavy and cold and impossible to set down. Megan calls every Sunday. We talk about her students, about Scott. They're engaged now, about wedding plans and her hope that I'll walk her down the aisle next summer. I tell her, of course I will, that I wouldn't miss it, and I mean it. But I also think about standing in a church surrounded by woods, about the ceremony ending at dusk, about the vulnerability of crowds distracted by celebration. Maybe I'm paranoid. Maybe 5 years is long enough that the thing in the woods has forgotten about the logger who shot it, has moved on to other territory, other prey. Maybe it's even dead, those 3 slugs doing damage that finally caught up to it. But I don't believe that. Can't make myself believe it. Because every few months I'll see a story online. Livestock killed up near Marquette. Hiker missing in the Huron Mountains. Strange tracks found by a DNR officer. And I'll read it with my stomach tight and wonder if it's starting again. If it's ready now. If all that patient learning has led to something worse than midnight visits to isolated timber tracks. I keep my rifle clean, keep my truck maintained, keep my phone charged and my doors locked and my life simple enough that I can walk away from it if I have to. Again, that's what it's come to. 5 years of a half-life, of looking over my shoulder, of never quite settling in, because settling in means assuming you're safe, and I know better now. Know that safety is an illusion we tell ourselves to sleep at night. That the darkness holds things we don't understand. That the old woods remember what we've forgotten. Sometimes I think about going back, about driving up to the Huron Mountains with proper equipment this time, with backup and cameras and the determination to prove what I saw, to make someone believe me, to do something about the thing that's up there. But then I remember those eyes. That intelligence, the way it had studied me, learned from me, let me go because I wasn't important enough yet, and I stay in Manistee, cutting plantation pine, living above a bait shop, visiting my daughter on Sundays, and sleeping with the lights on. Because some things aren't meant to be proven, some things are meant to be survived, and survival, I've learned, is enough.